I apologize for the people online for what happened last week when you actually couldn't hear the presentation because we had some serious technological challenges. So hopefully we overcame those challenges, right? And here we go. So what I will say to those who were not here last time, we spoke about Buber. I presented Buber for you, and I'll start because I always like to do a review of what I did, and so we can move to the next one. And I will start by talking kind of Buber as a Jewish philosopher, or what can Buber teach us about Jewish philosophy, and then our focus is Soloveitchik. So I'll tell you quite a lot about Soloveitchik, and what I would ask that please try to stay until the end. Don't move out in the kind of, or leave in the middle or before the end, and we can spend some time just talking. I think that the point of this conversation is not to dish out information about anything. It's about creating a learning environment and a learning community, and hopefully people will begin to see that these ideas, these texts, these people are very, very interesting and worthy of our time. So if you remember what I said last week, if not, you have access to the lecture, right, Lisa? You are going to share all the lectures from last week, can be shared or has been shared, I'm not sure. So I presented to you the complexity or the richness of Buber. So he's not doing just one thing. He's commenting on the Bible, he interprets the Bible, he writes about sociology, which is actually the very beginning of the discipline of sociology as an academic discipline. So he's at the forefront of the discipline emerging within the academy. He writes quite a lot about political theory. He has ideas which he traces all the way back to the Bible as the source of his idea. Of course, he's a theologian, he's a philosopher, he's also has a lot to say about ethics. That's what we focused on last time. And the point I want to suggest to you that he, as well as Soloveitchik, as well as Kaplan, these are all institution builders. They don't just write for themselves. They always create the wherewithal or the institutional setting within which Jews can engage in thinking, reflection, and going deep into what they need to know. So he's a public intellectual and he's an educator. So I put the question, what do we learn about Jewish philosophy by encountering Buber or by reading Buber? If we start from the, now I have to see how I use the, well, never mind. We start from the left, I guess, what's your left? Jewish philosophy is always rooted in the sources of Judaism. So if you are a Jewish philosopher, you're gonna say something about the Bible. There's just no way around it. If you know the Talmudic literature very well, and all of these people knew it, you're gonna say something about the Talmud, broadly speaking, so both Halakha and Agadah, more Agadah than Halakha, although Soloveitchik is a different case. But basically, you're going to be engaged in Jewish sources. At the same time, if you're a Jewish philosopher, as Buber showed us what it means to be a Jewish philosopher, you are always going to encounter non-Jewish philosophy. So the whole history of Jewish philosophy always is a conversation. It's a dialogue with non-Jewish thinking. Whether non-Jewish thinking is secular or religious, it doesn't matter. That's why I think that philosophy is important to us, because philosophy really enables us to have a conversation with non-Jewish thinking or non-Jewish culture. So keep that in mind. Buber also shows us how you have to do Jewish philosophy by engaging other disciplines, other intellectual disciplines, so he does. Philosophy, theology, sociology, history, of course, biblical exegesis, and literature, and so forth. So it's a very rich way of doing philosophy. Philosophy, we can learn from Buber, is always about the human condition. In that sense, it's universal, but it's also about being Jewish. What does it mean to be a Jew, and how being Jewish relates to being human? And a lot of the conversation, especially in the modern period, was about that kind of issue. Jewish philosophy, as we saw in the case of Buber, is written in a non-systematic way. So the style of Jewish philosophy is different from the style of Christian philosopher, let's say, especially those who teach in a university. So Jewish philosophers don't write like Hegel. They don't write like Kant. They write differently. And because what they're trying to always do is interpret the text, the canonic text, usually the Bible, but not all, a lot of them also write about Talmudic texts. Jewish philosophy explains Judaism to Jews, but also explains Judaism to non-Jews. So that's the back and forth, the universal and the particular, the insider and the outsider at the same time. And Jewish philosophy, because of that, as did Buber as an example, always talks about the condition in which we find ourselves. So there's always going to be a conversation about politics, about social problems, about cultural problems. Jewish philosophy responds to all of that. And Jewish philosophy can be written or can be expressed in either secular or religious idioms. Both of those modalities exist, and they are not in conflict with each other. I think they only enrich each other. So that's why Buber is a good place to start. Our focus today is this person. How many people actually are familiar with this picture? So about half of you know, and some people here in the room told me that they actually either met, right? You told me you either met Rav Soloveitchik, or you studied him, or you encountered him. So that's wonderful. So we'll start with that. If you're not familiar with Soloveitchik, he really is the spirit. He was and still is in many ways the spiritual leader of modern Orthodoxy in America. He was a brilliant Talmudist. He explains to us how to read a Talmudic text, and he was superbly good at it. He's a theologian, but his main concern is to figure out the relationship between Judaism and science, or in Hebrew, between Torah and Mada. So Torah and Mada actually have the book here, or in the Ashkenazi pronunciation, Torah and Mada, but it's the same thing. Torah and Mada is the name of a movement, of an intellectual strand within modern Orthodoxy that focused on integrating philosophy and Judaism, or Torah and science, if you wish. So like Buber, he was a very, very talented educator. I'll show you some pictures of him in action. He was also a public intellectual, had to say a lot about Zionism. Actually, he was a religious Zionist. When the state of Israel came into existence, actually he was considered more than once to be chief rabbi of Israel. So this person really has a lot of involvement in public life. Here is another way of answering the same kind of questions. I would say that Soloveitchik was almost, maybe not single-handedly, but primarily responsible for making Orthodox Judaism, or modern Orthodox Judaism, to be intellectually respectable, interesting, appealing. A lot of people count themselves as disciples, if you wish, of Rav Soloveitchik. Even if you are not necessarily a person who went through Yeshiva University where he was primarily teaching, you would consider yourself a person who stands in relationship with the teaching of the Rav, the rabbi, okay? As far as his style of thinking, he's very analytical, very clear, very precise, but at the same time, he's also, there's a strong emotional dimension to him. And he's very attentive to the internal struggle that all of us, especially people who are religiously motivated and oriented, the kind of internal struggle that a person like that, the religious person, feels in contemporary society. So emotionally, he was actually very open, very attentive. I'll tell you more how it's related to Hasidism in a minute, but I think this person is, don't think that he's just cerebral, that he's just about ideas. There's a lot about emotions. He's an existential, he's considered a philosopher of religious existentialism, so that means that he's about the human condition, the challenges that we all feel internally, personally, subjectively, and so forth. He also spoke a lot to Christian theologians. You'll see it when we talk about the lowly men of faith. So he's very much involved in the world, but he also insists. So there's a limit of how much dialogue there can be between Jews and Christians. So it's got a very interesting story, how he's speaking to Christians, but also understands the limits of that conversation. So in other words, if you want to know something about modern Orthodox existence in the 20th century and the 21st century, you have to talk about him. How do we put him in the history of Jewish philosophy? So we definitely have to see the connection between Soloveitchik in the 20th century and the greatest Jewish philosopher that probably ever lived, and that's Moses Maimonides. Maimonides died in 1204, so early 13th century. Soloveitchik is in that trajectory or tradition of Jewish intellectual philosophical thinking that existed definitely from the 10th century on, and perhaps we can go even further than that. But he's at the same time a product of Talmudic culture, specifically East European Talmudic culture. So he is focused on studying, interpreting, making sense of the Talmudic text. If in the big debate between the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim, he was definitely associated with the opponents of Hasidism, but his heart, because of experiences early on in life, he was much more open to Hasidism than you would expect. So it's kind of both. As I will tell you later, he was a close friend, actually, of the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe. They studied together, and they were in the University of Berlin at the same time, and clearly he's very open to Hasidism, even though he's very kind of analytical, cerebral, intellectual, and so forth. The Haskalah, the Jewish Haskalah movement, which opened up Judaism to the culture of the 19th century, also is something that he knows very well. So Moses Mendelssohn is not identical with what Soloveitchik is going to tell us, but clearly without Moses Mendelssohn, who died in 1786, we would not have a Soloveitchik. So we need this entire trajectory in order to make sense of Soloveitchik. Of course, the closest kind of people who inspired him are the neo-Orthodox thinkers, especially Samson Raphael Hirsch, who died 1888. And you cannot tell the story of or understand Soloveitchik without knowing that Jews were trying to figure out how to be a modern person and committed to total observance of, complete observance of halachic life. And that's basically the project that he's doing, and it starts with Samson Raphael Hirsch already. So here's on the left is Samson Raphael Hirsch. There's a lot of text here, you don't need to read it, but basically I suggest that we look at Soloveitchik in the context of that much longer arc of Jewish development, Jewish intellectual life. And these two people, Azriel Hilsheimer on the right and Samson Raphael Hirsch, are the people who really created a way to be Jewish, but to be intellectually engaged with all aspects of secular knowledge, secular culture. So that's what he's doing, and that's how I like to present Soloveitchik. So Soloveitchik is modern Orthodox as opposed to ultra-Orthodox. Okay, so this is an example, many people may know this famous picture. That's the Chatam Sofer, as is known, or Moshe Sofer, or Moses Schreiber, basically. And what you have here is the person who really opposed what modern Orthodoxy was about. So he's challenging the desire to modernize Judaism, and he was against emancipation. He wanted Judaism to be much more insular, much more looking inward rather than looking outward. So I'm not going to say much about him, but just I bring it up just to tell you how Soloveitchik was very involved in the world around him, especially the world of science, the world of medicine, and of course, philosophy. So this is briefly, we won't go through it. Many people are familiar with the big debate in the 19th century between the Hasidim and their opponents, the Mitnagdim. And Hasidism is a revival movement. It's a lot about emotional exuberance. It's about ecstasy. It's about connection between the Hasid, the pietist, and the Rebbe. His spiritual guide, if you wish, but also the spiritual intercessor between the world here, the world as we know it, and the divine world. So we won't get into that. But just if you're interested in some books, there's a lot of a lot of new material available about Hasidism. Probably I will suggest you the book in the middle, Hasidism and New History. It's a big book, but it's a wonderful collection of essays about Hasidism as a movement, as a social movement, as an intellectual, cultural movement. It's an absolute must. It was edited by David Beale, who unfortunately passed away just a few months ago. But a lot of new scholarship that's coming to us from Poland. There's a lot of new scholarship in Poland represented in this marvelous book. So Hasidism is important. Here's just, I'm showing you two pictures. This is, of course, contemporary pictures, just to juxtapose this visual image with this visual image. So you can see the difference between what an ultra-Orthodox person will look like, if obviously most of you are familiar, and you can see Soloveitchik right here. Why can't oh, sorry. How do I do the, just to show them a particular spot on the, no? Okay, so you can see Soloveitchik is right with his back against the blackboard, and here in the other picture, he's sitting right at the kind of the center of this spot. But what's wonderful about those pictures is to see him as an educator and how close he is to his students, to whom he's explicating the Talmudic text. So it's a wonderful intimacy that is going on here. And that partly explains the admiration and almost adoration that people had to him as a teacher and as a thinker. So we'll go through it. Now I won't say more about Hasidism, but let's go. The dates are not important, but just to give you a certain sense of his trajectory of life. Basically, he's born in Poland into a family of very illustrious rabbinic scholars. The pedigree goes really a long way back, and it's too detailed to bring in here. But what's interesting about it is that even though he was born into an Orthodox family, especially after the family moved to Warsaw, the decision was to open him up beyond the world of the academy itself, beyond the world of the yeshiva. So he's actually, and not just him, his father too, he's open to philosophy, to European culture, European literature that came primarily from the mother. And he made a decision to study in Polish university. So he gets his degree in the Free Polish University in 1924, and then he can go to a German university. Yeah, that's University of Berlin. University of Berlin actually attracted a lot of Orthodox Jews during the 20s, and he had some of his long-term relationship and friendships were forged as a student in University of Berlin. So he's doing a PhD on Hermann Cohen. In my class at ASU, we spent a week or 2 weeks on who was Hermann Cohen, why was it so important. We cannot do it right here, but basically he's writing a dissertation on the most important Jewish neo-Kantian, namely a Jewish philosopher who insisted that Kantianism is the right way to go. Now, he's doing it in the second half of the 19th century when Kant's people debated how important Kant is or what's problematic about Kant. Of course, Kant is very important, Immanuel Kant, who died in 1804. But Soloveitchik is writing about a Jewish interpreter of Immanuel Kant. So he's very much a philosophical, superbly trained as a philosopher. He's going to come to the United States in 1932, so it's right before the Nazis really get power. And the reason he could do it, the reason he could settle here was that his father was already here. Father was teaching at Yeshiva University. Basically, Soloveitchik is going, after the death of the father, I think 1941, basically Soloveitchik will replace him and will become almost, I would say, a fixture, if you wish, or a symbol or an icon of Yeshiva University. So from 1941 to 1986, he's teaching in Yeshiva. You have generations of American rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, all product of that institution and kind of influencing American life because of him. He died in 1993 as a result of long protracted illness. His wife, unfortunately, to whom he was very close, Tanya, she died in 1967. Same year also his mother died and his brother died. So it's really dramatic, very traumatic year for him. And he spoke a lot about her death and how difficult it was to overcome death. So he was emotionally actually remarkably open about himself. So here are some of his books. He's actually not a very, in terms of philosophical output, not a lot. I have some of the books here with me. Halachic Mind I have here, Halachic Man, The Emergence of Ethical Men. These are short books, relatively speaking. He didn't write as much. And the reason he didn't write as much, the most famous one is the book in the third, kind of from the left, the second from the left, The Lonely Man of Faith. That's actually originally an essay. I have the original essay here. It's only less than 60, it's about 60 pages, that's all. That is a marvelous piece of work. If you want to read just one thing by him, I would say read that wonderful text. I'll have to say more about it later. Now, the reason he was such a parsimonious kind of writing, he explains it himself. He says, I'm a funny animal. I'm a perfectionist. I'm never sure something is the best I can do. So if you think like that, it's very hard to be a productive scholar in terms of output. So he taught primarily orally. He's really an oral teacher more than a person who writes more and more, books after books. And after his death, actually, some of his disciples, especially David Schatz, has produced a lot of the books. I think I have, did I bring it? Some of the books are now being published in a publisher in Israel, and more of the stuff of his teaching, of his lectures, of his essays that are not published previously are now available. So he's mainly a teacher. Here are some of the books that I highly recommend you take a look at least at one of them. If I were to choose, I would probably take the book by David Hartman, because Hartman was a disciple and a student of Soloveitchik and a wonderful writer who really explicated the ideas. So Soloveitchik, I have many more books at home and here. Soloveitchik continues to inspire other people to think about the important things. So here are two institutions that he was associated with. On the left is Yeshiva University, and that's the logo of Yeshiva University. And you can see, if you know Hebrew, you can see that in the middle of the logo, what we have is Torah and Vemada, Torah Mada. So that's the logo, that's a slogan, that's the title of this entire approach to integrating Jewish learning and secular culture. The Maimonides School is a school that he created in Boston because he lived in Boston, even though he taught at Yeshiva since 1941. He lived in Boston. He was the rabbi of the community in Boston, but also a major educator. The fact that he chose to call his school Maimonides School tells you what the ideal is. And he did it together with his wife, a very important institution that still exists. You can go online and see where they are today. So on top of all this, he's also a religious Zionist. He's associated with Agudat Israel, but basically the point here that he's not like ultra-Orthodox. Ultra-Orthodox opposed the state of Israel, or at least had problems with the state of Israel. He did not. So from the very beginning, he's very much pro state of Israel, even though, whether to have a state or not to have a state was debated, deeply debated before 1948. So again, no religious Zionism today can really continue to think about what it means to be a religious Zionism without him. So as far as his approach, his analytical approach to Judaism, to Talmudic studies, the point for here in this summary here is to realize that he uses his mind, he uses his great analytical power in order to explain concepts and principles. So the method, what is called the Brisker method, is basically an analytical thing that treats what he would call the facts of halakha. He's trying to identify the facts of Jewish life, and he's going to use his brilliant knowledge to explicate what those facts. So to be a religious Jew for him is not just about the heart. It's not just about whatever, your imagination. It's about what you know, and there is an objective reality to all aspects of your life. So I hope that will make some sense. I know it may be a little bit too abstract right now, but I think you'll get his orientation in a minute. So when he's writing about halakha, he's trying to figure out, he's trying to articulate a philosophy of Judaism. So the data, the objective data, is what the laws are and how the laws have been interpreted. But you have to interpret the laws, you have to go in, you have to go deeper into why do we have those, what we call, why do we have those mitzvot? Why do we have those commandments? What's the rationale for those commandments? What's going on? So he's trying to kind of give you the objectivity, the objective dimension of halachic life. So he's trying to put some halachic life in a kind of an order. And look at the last line. There's a big word there, phenomenological analysis of religious life. He's trying to figure out what is this phenomenon we call religion? What is it? What does it mean to be religious? What kind of issues you're going to deal with if you are religious? So this is a little bit too technical here. It's maybe a little bit too much philosophy, but the point here, just to kind of whet your appetite, is to realize that he followed Hermann Cohen. That's why he did his dissertation on Hermann Cohen. But Hermann Cohen was associated with Reform Judaism, whereas Soloveitchik is actually trying to almost kind of offer us the science of halakha, the science of this halachic life. How do I do it in a way that explains to be Jewish from within, so to speak? It's not about dogmas. It's not about things that you have to affirm just in your head. It's how you live as a religious person. And Hermann Cohen, he was very close to Hermann Cohen, but of course not identical with Hermann Cohen. So this is what he's after. Here's just a quote from one of his books. I'll read it and see if it resonates in you in some ways. From where we to, as I say, hypothetical, for where we to analyze the mystery of the God-man relations, and that of course brings to mind Buber, because Buber was also about God-man's relations. As reflected in their Jewish religious consciousness, it would be necessary that we first gather all objectivized data at our disposal. Passages in the Holy Writ, that's of course the Bible, pertaining to divinity and divine attributes, moments of tensions between God and man, as in the case of Job, many halachic problems where certain attitudes of men toward divinity have found their expressions, all forms of cult, liturgy, prayer, and Jewish mysticism. Out of this enormous mass of objectivized constructs, the underlying subjective aspects could gradually be reconstructed. So keep in mind that last word, reconstructed, because we're going to talk next week about Mordechai Kaplan. Mordechai Kaplan is talking about reconstructing Judaism. And look what we are finding here also. It's about reconstructing Judaism. So why did he need to reconstruct Judaism? Wasn't it already in good shape? Well, not really. When he came to the United States, 1932, Orthodoxy was not what you know it today. Orthodoxy really had to make its case, especially toward non-Orthodox forms of Judaism. In the United States, especially since 1875, the expectation was that we will only have Reform Judaism in America. That's not what happened. So he's reconstructing Judaism in a sense of making Judaism intellectually accessible and understandable, even to people who are Orthodox or those who are not Orthodox yet, or even Christians. So this book I have here with me. This is a very small book. It's a really beautiful philosophical book. And, I think that what's interesting is the subtitle, which doesn't come clear on the slide. The subtitle is An Essay on Jewish Tradition and Modern Thought. This is a book of philosophy filled with references to European thinkers and engaging them, whether it's Kant, whether it's Hegel, whether it's Bergson, okay, whether it's Schiller, it doesn't matter, he's going to explore. And what does he have to explore? He has to explain what does it mean to be a halachic mind. A halachic Jew means kind of how you construct your worldview. So look at the middle of the slide. His question is, what is it about reality that shaped the mind of the authentic Jew? Now, we're going to talk about that in the next slide. Who is the authentic Jew? He thinks that he knows who authentic Jews are. That's a bit problematic. And he's going to say, what categories of experience do Jews impose on the world? So he thinks that if you're an Orthodox Jew, you have a lens, a way to look at the world in a particular angle, from a particular perspective. And that's what he's trying to explicate in the halachic mind. So the questions that come up to me, at least, is, are non-halachic forms of Judaism not authentic? So is Reform Judaism not authentic Judaism? Is conservative Judaism not authentic? That's a question. Or Constructionist Judaism? What about secular Jews? What about humanistic Jews? Where do they fit in his outline, in his outlook? So we need to ask, what do Orthodox Jews and non-Orthodox Jews have in common? Where do they differ? If he's giving us the objective reality of what it means to be Jewish, well, what about those who don't observe halakha? So every person in the room can actually think about that question. You probably know who this is, right? Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Who knows him, yes? Everybody knows him. He was, unfortunately, he passed away 2020. But he was the chief rabbi of the Orthodox community, not all Jews in England, only the Orthodox communities, as they're called, the Hebrew congregations. And he was a student, in a sense, a disciple of Soloveitchik, but also a person who was very close to the seventh Lubavitcher rabbi, to Menachem Schneerson. Those were his two major inspirations. So let's look at the citation from him. Rabbi Soloveitchik spoke about the need to create new kind of Jewish thought based not on philosophical categories. There's a mistake here, but on halakha, I will fix it, but on halakha and Jewish law. Law was the lifeblood, the DNA of Judaism, and it was more than mere regulation of conduct. It was a way of being in the world, and that's what Soloveitchik is after. What does it mean to be in the world as a Jew, as an observant Jew? Okay, so definitely Rabbi Sachs continues. Soloveitchik has wonderful essays about Soloveitchik, and if you want to get to Soloveitchik, a good way to start is not just Hartman, but also Rabbi Sachs. So in the halachic mind, some of the, I hope you're getting a little bit of a taste of what he's after here. The interesting thing that he wants to tell us is this. Look at the top left. There's no single accepted interpretation of what the real world, physical or social, is made of. In other words, he's going to be arguing for pluralism. So it's sufficiently pluralistic. There's no one way to see reality. There are many ways. He's also introducing a perspectival approach to religious life, to Jewish life, to life in general. The fact that he focuses on perspective this is another wonderful book, but it's philosophically heavy, I have to admit. It's called Nietzsche. Everybody knows who Nietzsche was. Nietzsche, Soloveitchik, and contemporary Jewish philosophy. Can you imagine putting Nietzsche and Soloveitchik together? Yes. This guy, Daniel Reinholz, teaches philosophy at Yeshiva, as a matter of fact. And Michael Harris is in England. And these wonderful scholars, Jewish philosophy, arguing that to understand Soloveitchik, you have to understand Nietzsche. You have to understand what they have in common and where they differ. So this is just to tell you how rich this man was, how complex, how intellectually interesting. So there may be a little bit too much philosophy here on it, but the bottom line is that philosophy of religion has its own unique, that's in the middle bottom, its own unique intellectual methodology, And it's not science, it's different from science, but you have to understand it kind of on its own terms. So what he's trying to do is to get to the heart of what is religious life, how to think as a religious person, how to relate it to the philosophy that exists. By the way, I didn't tell you, but it was on the slide, I believe. He studied mathematics at the University of Berlin. So he was that's the fact that he's a mathematician by training is actually quite relevant. Hermann Cohen also was a mathematician. Halachic Man, that's another book. Those books are actually written in the 40s, in the mid-40s, but they were published later. One, I think, 1978, one in 1986. So it's published later. He was really quite slow to publish. And here what he's trying to tell us also, he's trying to figure out who is the halachic man, how does the halachic man relate to other types. He always thinks in terms of types, ideal types, and that's, of course, a way of thinking that was very common in European thought, 1920s, starting primarily with the work of Max Weber. So Max Weber, the famous sociologist, the father sociologist, kind of pushed that kind of thinking, not alone. There were other people in the same vein, and Soloveitchik is also going in that direction. So when you think in terms of ideal types, he's going to talk about the cognitive man or the religious man or the halachic man, and a lot of the subtleties in interpreting what he had in mind is trying to figure out the relationship between those types. And it's not simple, but the point is to recognize that to be a religious person in a secular world requires a different mindset, a different way of looking at the world, a different way of looking at reality. And he's trying to show that the halachic man, the observant Jew, combines the cognitive man and the religious man. But the subtleties of what he says in each person about each type in each book kind of gets a little bit dense. So I'm not going to go through the details of it, but just imagine this person's trying to identify the essence of things. So what is the essence of being a scientific person, or cognitive person, or religious person, or halachic person? So here I like the word that I want you to remember is the word dialectical. Soloveitchik was really attuned to internal conflict. We are not simple creatures. We are complex. So he's not glossing over anything. And he doesn't think that philosophy is going to progress in a certain way and reach a certain resolution to the conflict. No, what we need to do is to live the conflict, recognize the conflict, and in a sense, experience the richness of the conflict. So in the richness of the conflict, you're going to have the heart and the mind, the intellect and the emotion, the science and the religion. All of it is together, and he's trying to figure out, it's not so much about a balance, but the internal logic of that kind of life. So you can see that this man had to spend a lot of time in introspection to think about himself. And he does it as much as Buber did it, and we're going to see a lot also the same in Mordechai Kaplan. And Kaplan, for example, wrote for years, he wrote a diary. So we know an awful lot about it from his diary. A similar thing here with Soloveitchik. Here are some of the thinkers that influenced him. This is if you're interested in the history of philosophy. I won't get into them, but the Max Scheler, who is less known, is the person who inspired this book, The Emergence of Ethical Man. That's a book that was published after Soloveitchik died, so that was published in 2005. But most of the ideas in this book are actually coming from Max Scheler, who is this German philosopher, very interesting philosophy, a very interesting philosopher. Not very well known in the United States. So now a few words about the Lonely Man of Faith. And how are we doing? We're doing well on time. So The Lonely Man of Faith is the most famous essay. It's appeared in a book, so this book cover is because it was published as a book, but originally it was published in the journal Tradition, which is the journal of Orthodox Judaism. And what's interesting about it, that his essay actually came originally, well, it was published in 1965. It came after the initial draft of Vatican II became available. So in a sense, this book is a response to Vatican II. And it was actually based on lectures that he gave in a Catholic seminary. And it's very important that he can talk to Christians. If you read the text, you will find that some even technical Christian terms like kerygma, which is kind of the esoteric meaning of the Christ event, is used by Soloveitchik. So he's talking to Christians, and I actually, from my own experience, I know that even in the class that I taught at ASU, I had a student there who was a conservative Christian and loved Soloveitchik. Of all the scholars that I shared in the class, I have one student from that class here in the audience. He loved Soloveitchik above all. So that's kind of very interesting why Soloveitchik could be taken so seriously and so deeply, really treated with a lot of respect, a lot of reverence by Christian clergymen. So here is a little bit more of the context. They look at line number 3. What I want you to keep that phrase in mind is that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to explain halachic normativity, why I do what I need to do. What is normativity? What makes it normative? What is the compelling power of the halachic tradition? And he's explaining it to Christians in a way that makes it easier for them to accept a Jew on his own terms, but yet he did not believe that you can do theological dialogue with Christians. There cannot be a Jewish-Christian theological dialogue according to Soloveitchik, but what there can be is coexistence of Jews and Christians and respect, mutual respects to both traditions. So we are probably not so far from what he already thought then. I love the beginning of the text. This is page 8. I have it here. I'll just give you a little bit just to give you a taste of how he felt, what it means to be a lowly man of faith. So I'm reading from his text. The man of faith is a stranger in modern society, which is, look at the beautiful this kind of characterization, technically minded, self-centered, self-loving, almost in a sickly, narcissistic fashion, scoring honor upon honor, piling up victory upon victory, reaching for the distant galaxies and seeing in the here and now sensible world the only manifestation of being. So that's what it means to be a modern person. That's what most people are in that first categorization. So now comes his dilemma. What can a man of faith like myself, living by a doctrine which has no technical potential, by law, which cannot be tested in the laboratory, steady in his loyalty, I guess it should be, to an eschatological vision, that's a messianic vision, whose fulfillment cannot be predicated with any degree of probability, let alone certainty. So how can I, as a person of faith, live in the secular world? That's the challenge. In a sense, he's saying all Jews, if they take Judaism seriously as a religious system, a religious way of life, experience that challenge. That's the dilemma. That's the conundrum. And he's going to write in this beautiful essay, he's going to give us 2 types. Again, it's typology. He likes to speak in typological ideal types. He's going to give us a summary of 2 orientations. He's going to call one Adam 1 or Adam the first, and the other one is Adam the second. Those 2 orientations are based on the first 2 creation narratives in the book of Genesis. So Genesis 1 tells us one story of creation. Genesis 2 gives us a different story of creation. And he's not going to say, look, there's a contradiction here, it's difficult to resolve. No, he's saying these are orientations of the human conditions. That's how people feel. So I have a good summary for you here. So Adam 1, Genesis 1, Adam 2, Genesis 2. And basically Adam 1 is the technological person, the person who looks at the world, uses the world, builds in the world, feels dignity from doing all the wonderful things that we're doing today, let's say going to the moon or whatever. And he's saying that's just one aspect, but that's not the other aspect, which is for him more important. It's a person who has a relationship with God, a covenantal relationship, a person who is a humble servant, a person who is whose job in life is to keep and protect the earth. Those are two statements: that to fill the earth and subdue it, that's Genesis 1:26, and to keep and protect the earth, that's Genesis 2:15. And actually, if you're interested in environmentalism, these two verses are crucial to Jewish environmentalism. There's a lot of conversation about that, but that's for another lecture, maybe another time. So here's another book. I think I brought it with me. No, I didn't. But that's a collection of essays. But the beautiful essay, it's a short essay, but very meaningful, under the title of Majesty and Humility, also published in Traditional Journal of Orthodox Jewish Thought. And I'll just read part of it, that you get a sense of what does it mean to think like Soloveitchik. So look at the beginning. Man is a dialectical being. That's a very important word. Obviously, it's an old world in Western philosophy. Plato had a lot to say about dialectical thinking, and so did Hegel. But look at how he is interpreting it. An inner schism runs through his personality at every level. The schism is not due to man's revolution against his maker, as Christian theology, the typo there, has preached since the days of Augustine. Unlike this view, basically what he's going to show that we are but his sinful rebellion against his maker precipitated the split in human nature. The Judaic view posits that it will be willed by God as a source of man's greatness and his election as a singular charismatic being. So for Soloveitchik, to be a human has a lot of dignity in being human, but the dignity comes not from controlling nature or controlling the physical world, but standing in a relationship, a humble relationship with God. So if you look at the last line, just the penultimate line, where he talks about tragic living. So we are all tragic. There's something really tragic going on in our life because our life is always conflicted. And we have to kind of figure out how to reconcile all those complexities. So I love his psychological depth. So here's another summary of the difference between Adam 1 and Adam 2. But the most important thing is at the bottom, the third line, both Adams are fascinated with the mystery of existence. That's why people relate to him as a philosopher of existence or existentialist philosopher, and share the desire to be human as God commanded them to be. The diverse methods are the result of different interpretive approaches to a common goal. So it's not one or the other. We are both, and we have to kind of live and slug through, I guess, or struggle, wrestle through the different orientations that we bring by being human. He had a lot to say about loneliness versus aloneness, but he actually felt, we know it from his own writing, he felt himself to be the lonely man of faith. He feels the loneliness, and even though he lives in the presence of God, very much like Buber, but the reason he can overcome the problem is he lives in a community, or what he calls a covenantal community. So in a community, this problem or this condition can be addressed. But if you just think in secular terms, it's going to be even more problematic. He is alone, but look at the difference, how he uses the word alone and lonely. So he's kind of in the world, in the community, but also have a very strong sense of otherness, of being different from people around. Very quickly basically, he's a critic of modernity, a lot of things in modern life, and he's writing, most of it is in the middle of the century, of the 20th century. Today, the situation will be even much worse, I would say, because of technology. So he was very much a critic of the kind of the technologization and the mechanization of life. And to begin toward the conclusion, you can see that Buber and Soloveitchik, that seem to us so far apart, they're not really so far apart. They actually have a lot in common, even though, of course, they are different. So they both, if you look at the left, obviously, they share knowledge of Judaism, intricate knowledge of Judaism. Although Buber was not a Talmudist. Soloveitchik knows a lot more Talmud than did Buber. Buber focused primarily on Agadah, not on Halacha. They're products of the university, that's University of Berlin. They have both open and very welcoming, positive attitude toward Hasidism. They're both, I would say, educators par excellence. They really care about education. They're both Zionists in different ways. They belong to different parts of the Zionist movement. Of course, Buber was not part of Agudat Israel, but they're both very committed to Zionism. Actually, Soloveitchik, more than Buber, took the founding of the State of Israel as the real goal. It was not the goal for Buber. So they are also different. Buber is more kind of, you can look at Buber as more as a romantic thinker, because he's interested in myth, he's interested in mysticism. Soloveitchik is not a mystic, but he has the depth. His depth is kind of a different kind. He's not thinking, it's kind of less imaginative. He doesn't write stories. Buber writes stories. So if I'm going to figure out what's the difference, a lot has to do with the role of the imagination. Buber is much more imaginative, much more of a poet. To my mind, to my knowledge, Soloveitchik was not a poet. Buber was, as was Kaplan, by the way. So in terms of science and halakha, a lot of it, as I mentioned here already, is he really articulated the goal of Torah U'Mad'a, science and Torah. So it's a combination of both science and Judaism. They're not contradictory, they're complementary. So keep that in mind. And in a sense, what he's giving us is kind of a philosophy of halakha that is structured like a science. So in that sense, there's a lot of similarity between him and Maimonides, and that's kind of the pedigree that you have to keep in mind if you want to make sense of his legacy. And here are some of the people who continue, who are disciples, if you wish. On the left is David Schatz, a wonderful philosopher of religion, writes a lot, not just about Jewish religion, but a philosopher of religion. So contemporary philosophy of religion, that's his book at the bottom. The middle one is Danny Statman. He writes a lot about virtue ethics. These are all Orthodox Jews, and you can see they're all young. And the other one, Samuel Labens, is in the University of Haifa. Actually, Danny Statman is also at the University of Haifa. And I put in at the bottom a book by Samuel Labens about Jewish philosophy in the analytic age. These people know a lot about analytic philosophy. People like Labens, people, actually all three of them, and they're trying to explain why halakhic Judaism is analytically deep and complex and subtle. So there's a lot of intellectual creativity going on among these people. So now we can take a few minutes, get some questions, and if not, we have some questions on the board. Okay, go ahead. What's that? Oh, you need the microphone? Oh, you have an extra? Okay, good. Okay, go ahead and then you, yeah. So give her the mic, please.
Hello. I was curious when you were speaking about
It's hard to hear for some.
Soloveitchik and the lonely man, and Adam and so forth, and you didn't say anything about women, and I wondered what Soloveitchik's position was on halakhic women and women. So what your take is on it?
So that's a very good point. So in the middle of the 20th century, as we saw in those pictures, there's no women in the room. It's a very different story today. Actually, there's a lot of intellectual work done primarily in Bar Ilan, in Israel, but also here in Yeshiva University, in Stern College. We're from Stern College. So I think that today, he was not a feminist. I just don't see any way to read him as a feminist. But there is a lot of new work done, let's say, by Ronit Irshai and by Tamara Ross. Ronit Irshai is a student of Tamara Ross, who are thinking through what's missing, exactly your question, what's missing, where are the women, why don't we hear enough about them? So that work is done, but I cannot try to tell you that he do it because he didn't. That work was not done by him. at that time in the middle of the 20th century. So most of his work, keep in mind, was really done in the 40s and 50s, and he is a Talmudic scholar. He's in Yeshiva University. So
Right. Well, actually, Hava, in that picture you showed of Soloveitchik teaching, there were two pictures. One of them did have women in it.
which one? I have to go back, and I want
yeah,
to
you
keep
don't-
this
I
in
mean-
mind.
Didn't. The one on the right, there were absolutely women in that room. They were kind of behind the chalkboard,
Really? Okay.
but they were definitely women. Yeah, because I noticed that.
There you
too.
go. Hooray for the women. So yeah, as a feminist, I can tell you it's good. But yeah, definitely there's an issue. Go ahead, please. Oh,
Sorry, I've gone to him. I'll come to you now. Okay.
Good afternoon. My question is regarding language, since the Rav basically was oral. My assumption is that his native language was Yiddish. Is that
Absolutely.
correct?
yeah.
When he first came to YU, did he initially speak in Yiddish and ultimately segue to English? Is that in fact
So
case?
yeah. So there are three languages, actually four. You can push it into four. But he was very clear that some texts are written in English for the general audience. The real stuff is written in Hebrew, actually. A lot is written in Hebrew, not in Yiddish. But I agree, he speaks Yiddish. That's what also his students were very comfortable with that. So that's the world they're all operating, right? He's in the 30s in Boston and then in New York. Of course, Yiddish is going to be the language. But if he published in Yiddish, I'm not familiar with those texts, but to my knowledge, it's really only those two languages, English. Now, he also knows Polish, he also knows German, so it goes without saying.
And in fact, is that the reason why his English seems to my ear to be very convoluted and difficult to follow?
I don't know, I think that it's more the mind rather than the linguistic expertise. I think his mind was very Talmudic. The way he sees everything kind of in a more entangled way, and that's hard. So like Buber, English is not his language too, but Buber is going to be a different kind of writing. Mordechai Kaplan is going to be a different kind of writer. I think it has to do with the kind of mind, rather than the mastery of the language. In Hebrew, because Hebrew is more natural to him. It's much more exegetical. The writing is much more exegetical. And you can come up with also linguistic insights that don't work in English. It only can work in Hebrew. So, so that's it. But it's interesting. I think it's also his philosophical reasoning. This is a product of German university. He knows a lot of phenomenology. And he's trying to understand experience from within. That doesn't allow you for simplicity, well, right? So that's how I would account. Yeah, it is, you have to slug through the text if that's what you're saying. I agree, it's not easy. Texts are not easy to read. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, so can you hear me if I talk?
But I
a
cannot
little
hear
bit
you.
louder? All right.
No.
Okay, so I lived through the yeshiva movement from the 1950s, 60s. I ended up at Stern College in 1970. We had Rev Soloveitchik speak to the girls exclusively every other Friday. He gave us a Musar shir. A Musar is like halachic, a halachic lecture on how to properly observe the mitzvot of the Chagim or Shabbos, whatever. But we had a halachic shir, and it was in English, by the way. He spoke to his audience. So when he was speaking to the yeshiva boys at YU, he spoke in Yiddish because the boys in REIT learned in Yiddish. They were coming from the 1940s and 50s, or those boys were born in the 50s or 40s. They knew Yiddish from home. Their parents were Yiddish. Some of them were even born in Europe. So they would be learning in Yiddish because yeshivas spoke in Yiddish. That was the language. Yeshiva Sprach, that was their language of study. But to the girls, he always spoke in English beautifully. And, you know, I was there for 3 years and I heard him so frequently, Rev Tendler, Rev Soloveitchik, Rev Feinstein, all of these great men spoke to us, but of course we were teenagers. What do we know? If we only would have known the Rav, you know, what he was, but it was excellent. And I have to say one thing about philosophy. Philosophy is great. Philosophers are great, but what is their legacy? I have to tell you about the legacy of Rav Soloveitchik and the Mizrahi movement and the Orthodox movement integrating secular and religious studies. When I was starting to go to university, my parents were looking around for a place to send me. I was from a small town in Canada, not even a kosher bakery, no kosher butcher. I had to travel to the United States every day for 12 years to go to Hebrew day school. It was a real struggle. There was no question. There was only one place in the world, even outside of, no place in Israel even, that had an Orthodox dormitory for women and an Orthodox dormitory separate for men. That was the only place I would ever have gone because I grew up Orthodox. And the philosophy of Rav Soloveitchik and the Mizrahi movement and his whole Brisker movement was educating women. Educate women, and you have an educated family and have a Jewish Orthodox family. If you only educate the men, everything's lost because the woman directs the house. So he believed in education for women. But not only that, with the education for women, he believed in women becoming doctors, lawyers, accountants, not just sitting at home and knitting, crocheting, baking cookies, and talking to their kids about Hebrew day school. That wasn't the whole philosophy. The whole philosophy was to be in the world and to function as an Orthodox Jew in the world, and that you could, you would, and today, Yeshiva University is still here. Stern College is still here. The Brisker Yeshiva is in upstate New York, uptown Manhattan, like Upper West Side, they're still here. And the Reshit Yerushalayim Yeshiva in Yerushalayim is a Brisker Yeshiva from the Soloveitchik family. So I don't know what Martin Buber, I don't know where his schools are today. I don't know where Kaplan's schools are today. You know, they're struggling. But I know Yeshiva University and the Orthodox halachic Mizrahi movement is what kept the Jewish state a Jewish state. Because if we want a Jewish state today, it has to have an opportunity for Orthodox Jews to practice their orthodoxy. It doesn't matter what level of orthodoxy, but every Jew is accepted and everything, you know, is recognized in the Bible, every way of life, they talk about the homosexuality in the Gemara. There are huge discussions about it. There are huge discussions about women living with women, men living with men. There are discussions about that because it was a reality of life 1,000 years ago. Nothing's changed, but I'm going to be quick now. But my whole point is that Rav Soloveitchik and the Yeshiva movement is really still alive. But I don't know about the Buberish movement or the Kaplanish movement or all these other movements. But really, you know, it's thriving and people are learning.
So yes, Soloveitchik definitely was a very powerful intellectual presence. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I'm just going to say, no, we're not going to take anyone like lecturing the group, just questions because we don't have a lot of time and I want to get questions from the people online too.
Yes, sir.
The two observations that I think are interesting because they're critically different about Soloveitchik. The one is that he was revered by his pupils and disciples who called him Harav, and he was revered in a way that Hasidic rebbes were revered, even though he himself was not part of the Hasidic movement. The second thing is, although he is the halachic man and it was so central to him, and from what I know, I didn't know Soloveitchik personally, but I know so many of his pupils and disciples. The tradition that follows today, the people that have followed him, for them, halakha is actually not that important. That arachim, that values, that Torah in derech eretz are much more important to them, even though they follow in the tradition of Soloveitchik. Halakha really, in some ways, follows in second place. Whether it's, you know, Hartman or Rav Riskin or Rabbi Sachs or these others, I'm not sure that they would put halakha in the same place that Soloveitchik. They follow Soloveitchik, but I think their message to the world isn't the centrality of halakha.
Yeah,
That's my
well,
understanding.
I'm not, I see where you're going with that question. I think that he's, because he was a systematic thinker in some way, he's in a sense, a scientist of halakha, right? He's giving us an inner structure. So in that sense, I think you're right that Hartman or Rav Sachs are not exactly the same kind of mind. But I wouldn't say that halakha was not important to Hartman or I wouldn't say that. Secondary, okay, so you're trying to, in a sense, you're trying to say that derech eretz or the values, the outlook, you're trying to put the Talmudic parts in a kind of secondary for them. I really shouldn't, it doesn't really matter. It seems to me that they're all trying for the same thing, how to be a religious person in a secular world. That's really the challenge. That's the challenge 20th century. In a sense, where we are today, in the beginning of the 21st century, we are not where we were in the 50s, right? Today, I would call where we are in a post-secular environment. So we are living through post-secularism. That explains why Orthodox Judaism today is doing much better than it did even in the 40s or 50s. And of course, that will have implications to what's going on in Israel. But I think that understanding his dilemmas in the middle of the 20th century, he's struggling with being who he is in a world that is very different from who he is. So he's trying to articulate an intelligent kind of Judaism, an intellectually oriented Judaism that can survive and thrive even in a secular world. So that would be my take. But what's secondary, what's primary, I guess everybody has his own view. Go ahead.
Okay, so we have 3 questions online. So did Rabbi Soloveitchik and Martin Buber, was Martin Buber a rabbi also?
No.
He was just a professor. So Martin Buber write about the documentary hypothesis regarding,
Yeah, so
probably explain documentary hypothesis.
yeah, so the documentary hypothesis, to those who are not familiar, is a kind of a slogan in a sense, or it's a phrase that captures biblical criticism in the modern world. It actually began in the second half of the 17th century. But the idea was that as you look at the biblical text, you can actually find the various literary strata that put together the biblical, that were put together by some editor or editors. Both Soloveitchik and Buber did not accept the documentary hypothesis as a way to interpret Judaism. So if you look at the biblical text from a documentary hypothesis perspective, you find contradictions, you find repetitions, you find things that don't make sense, you find things that relate to other cultures. And for both of those thinkers, they're trying to find the inner logic of the biblical text. So it's almost like, what did the editor think? How did the editor put it all together? So in that sense, they are aware of it, but they're not followers of that approach of the biblical text.
How did Orthodoxy look before Soloveitchik invigorated it with halakha?
Okay, that's a good question because, again, I'm not really I have to do some more to answer this question properly. I have to do some more, study a little bit more those sociologists of religion like Samuel Heilman. I can cite him as a person who really studied the sociology of Orthodoxy in America since the end of the 19th century. But definitely, the situation was not great. So I'll answer the question kind of in a roundabout way. What Soloveitchik was trying to do is not so different what Kaplan also tried to do at the same time, but going somewhat differently, more toward the documentary hypothesis, namely the historical study of Judaism. So Kaplan is going to give us an attempt to reconstruct, reinvigorate, reimagine Judaism for the modern world, and he's going to do it differently than Soloveitchik. So when we talk about Kaplan next week, you're going to hear that Kaplan was actually, as I'm sure many of you know, some of Kaplan's books were actually excommunicated. His Haggadah, his Passover Haggadah, was considered totally unacceptable by Orthodox Jews. So he was doing something other than that, but all 3 of them, Kaplan, Buber, Soloveitchik, all are trying to reinvigorate Judaism. So Judaism at the turn of the century in America was not doing so great. It needed a lot of oomph, a lot of rethinking, and that's what all 3 of them were doing. Yes?
Can you, does anyone else have a question? I just want to.
You said 3 questions there?
It was a comment, so I'm not gonna.
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay. Can you kind of give us a sneak peek as to next week? So to kind of.
What will next be?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to actually take a moment when we begin next time on Wednesday is a moment recognizing that we are in the Jewish Community Center. And we are doing exactly what Kaplan had in mind, where he created the institutions that will do what we are doing, namely studying together, thinking culturally about Judaism, addressing the problems of being Jewish in America. That's the project of Kaplan. That's what he was trying to do when he was thinking about Judaism as a civilization. Okay, so Buber is about Judaism as relationship. It's all about subject-subject relations. Soloveitchik is all about halakha, all about, in a sense, the mind and the relationship with God through the mind, and also through, I should say, through what you do with your body, through embodied Jewish life. And for Kaplan, it's going to be, let's recreate Jewish culture in a modern idiom, in a new way that fits the 20th century in a democratic society. That's the big issue for Kaplan, how to be Jewish in a democratic society without losing your identity. Because it's very easy to lose your identity as a Jew in a democratic, open society. So that's the challenge for next week. All right? You see how it all fits together? All right, we'll see you all.